Sirens smeared the night into red and blue ribbons as rain hissed on stone. A billionaire stood in handcuffs, shoulders squared, eyes locked on a small figure beyond the tape. The guard said, "Keep moving." The child did not move. Glass towers watched like silent jurors above the street. Inside one tower, a private office glowed cold, a throne room without a king. A magazine cover floated on a screen, his face smiling in a past he no longer owned. The child said, "Why are they taking him?" No answer came, only the wet click of metal and cameras. A voice said, "He built an empire, but he couldn't save her." The words fell heavier than the rain, and the night held its breath around them. The convoy rolled like a metal river, and the city leaned in to watch. The child's red coat became a beacon against the night, small and stubborn. The officer said, "Back up, please." The crowd pressed closer, hungry for certainty. Lenses hunted the man's face, and found only iron and rain. He glanced at the glass tower and saw himself reflected as a stranger. A reporter said, "Why now?" No one answered, because answers would cheapen the fear. Somewhere above, an empty office hummed with old triumphs and new ghosts. A voice said, "Power buys time, not mercy." The child lowered her hand, and the world felt colder. Inside the lobby, marble shone like a frozen lake, and security gates blinked patient green. The man walked between guards who never met his eyes. The guard said, "This way." The elevator doors parted with a sigh, as if tired of secrets. The child's reflection lingered on the glass from minutes ago, a ghosted palm in a smear of rain. A journalist said, "He built this, didn't he?" The clerk only shrugged. Overhead a chandelier trembled, as thunder stitched the night. A voice said, "He chose ascent over shelter." The doors closed, and silence sealed him in steel. The elevator rose, and his face fractured across mirrors into a dozen strangers. He touched the cuff mark and found no forgiveness there. The intercom said, "Top floor." The city unspooled beyond glass like tape, rewinding a life. The child outside vanished into the blur of umbrellas and headlines. The man breathed in, steady and thin, like someone borrowing air. The officer said, "You can cry later." The words hit, then slid off like rain on chrome. A voice said, "Victory keeps receipts." The bell chimed, and doors opened to rooms that suddenly felt like crime scenes. The office welcomed him like a museum of yesterday, immaculate and heartless. Awards lined the shelves like obedient soldiers. The screen still held his smiling cover, a grin that now felt borrowed. The assistant said, "They're waiting." He nodded, though no one had asked a question. The rain struck the glass harder, as if the night wanted in. Down below, the child turned away, choosing warmth over spectacle. A voice said, "He built an empire, but he couldn't save her." The line returned like a verdict. He stared at the city and wondered what price remained unpaid. The city slept while Adrian Vale counted debts only he remembered. He stood outside a shuttered store, where hunger once taught him math. Lila Vale said, "Please sir, I can restock tonight." The manager said, "Not hiring." The boy he was learned silence, and it scraped his ribs into armor. Adrian Vale said, "I will never beg time from anyone." The rain that night became a ledger, every drop a late fee on hope. He watched his mother fold dignity like a worn scarf and keep moving. Years later, riches came, yet the old neon still flickered in his sleep. He felt the weight of that promise like an anvil wired to a star. A voice said, he loved by building walls and called it shelter. He believed safety was a staircase, and he refused to pause on any landing. Mira Sayeed once stood outside a glass boardroom with courage burning holes in her palms. The receptionist said, "They are in session." "A partner," said she, "can wait in the hall." Mira Sayeed said, "I will not wait in the hall." She turned and wrote her plan on a stairwell wall with a pen and fury. The city hummed, unbothered by small revolutions. Shame tried to perch on her shoulder and found no purchase. She learned that power respects the door it cannot close. Years later, headlines learned her name, but the doorknob remembered her grip. A voice said, she loved him once, and he loved safety more. She kept the blueprint, folded sharp as a blade in her bag. She promised herself the next door would open, because she built it. Memory keeps its own filing system, and tonight it opened to a page with ink that never dried. Adrian Vale found an old book she once underlined, a margin where ambition flirted with tenderness. Mira Sayeed said, build without losing yourself. Adrian Vale said, losing myself is the price of the door. The line stung like lemon on a cut. He was a boy, guarding a throne he had not earned, and a man polishing the crown anyway. The city beyond the glass slowed to a heartbeat he could finally hear. A voice said, he mistook fear for discipline and called it virtue. He traced her handwriting as if it were a map away from winter. He folded the page and felt the creases cut his thumb. He wished vows could be rewritten without ink spilling on someone. The wound was not poverty alone. It was being seen and dismissed in the same breath. Layla Vale said, we will eat tomorrow. Adrian Vale said, tomorrow will answer to me. The line became his operating system, efficient and merciless. He learned to outrun birthdays and sleep, to trade warmth for warranties. The fortune arrived, but it sat on a cold plate. He found that winning without witnesses tastes like an apology to no one. Mira Sayeed said, shame is a smoke alarm, not a sermon. He heard it in rooms where praise echoed, and meaning did not. A voice said, he armored the heart that asked only for a door held open. He tightened the strap on that armor and called it leadership. The knight tightened back and asked for a receipt. They met again when the world called them by titles they had not dreamed. The room filled with money's perfume and unslept hours. Mira Sayeed said, you chose safety over us. Adrian Vale said, I chose a future where no one starves on principle. Her eyes softened, then steeled, like glass cooling into form. The distance between them felt engineered, precise, and sterile. A voice said, love that bargains with fear collects interest forever. He wanted to drop the crown and hold the hand that wrote in margins. The crown dug in, and the hand stayed by her side. She walked away carrying blueprints and a heartbeat that would not yield. He stood still, counting the seconds like coins he could not spend. The launch clock struck midnight, and the office breathed like a machine that disliked quiet. Adrian Vale led a war room, lit by dashboards and coffee rings. Adrian Vale said ship, then fix, then ship again. An engineer said, we need sleep. He smiled in a way that apologized without stopping. The skyline looked tired of carrying his promises. His phone buzzed with a message from no one he had time for. He thought of the cracked neon that raised him and doubled down. A junior asked about risk, and he answered with a plan that cost weekends. Adrian Vale said, I will be the storm, or I will drown it. The code deployed, and cheers felt like a receipt, not a song. A voice said, every victory moves the horizon. He nodded to a room that mistook devotion for warmth, as the knight signed another invoice in his name. Mira Sayeed pitched in rooms that loved her numbers, and not her voice. A partner said, bring a co-founder we know. Mira Sayeed said, you know me now. She sketched architectures on glass and made doubt look small. She hired people who could argue without leaving scars. The first prototype failed, and she laughed like a fuse. A mentor offered terms that tasted like chains. Mira Sayeed said, I build doors, not cages. She wired savings into payroll and slept on a sofa that judged no one. The team shipped a tool that found patterns others missed. Oz arrived, careful and late, and she bowed to no one. A voice said, fire learns shape from the hearth. She looked at the skyline and refused to ask it for permission. The calendar buzzed with a birthday he had promised to keep. Layla Vale said, no candles, just you. Adrian Vale said, I am 2 meetings away. The meetings bred like shadows and multiplied into excuses. He sent a car that arrived with flowers and silence. The driver said, "Ma'am, your son apologizes." She smiled into a window that reflected only her waiting. The product charts climbed like ivy around his ribs, pretty and constricting. Adrian Vale said, "I will make it right next week." A junior celebrated a win with cake no one tasted. The office lights hummed like a choir without lyrics. A voice said, he kept receipts for love and paid late fees. The night forgave nothing and moved on. The valuation crossed a line that made headlines speak in superlatives. Investors said, "Welcome to the club." Adrian Vale said, "Thank you," and felt nothing settle inside the noise. A friend slid a resignation across the table with eyes that asked for sleep. Adrian signed with a pen that dragged like a small anchor. The bell at the exchange rang in a room they rented by the hour. He held a trophy shaped like a promise to strangers. The team clapped because the script required it, and because hope is obedient. He checked a message from Mira he had never answered. She had written months ago, short and kind, and he had filed it under later. A voice said, "Winds that do not warm you teach colder lessons." He set the trophy down and missed the sound it made. Not. The contract that could crown a year came wrapped in knives. Mira Sayeed walked into the pitch with calm that bent the room toward her. Adrian Vale said, "We own the rails, they will choose us." His strategist said, "They will choose the future." Mira Sayeed said, "The future refuses tolls." The client listened, the way a sailor watches clouds. Numbers sparred and memory watched from the corner, uninterested in decorum. He saw the margin note she wrote years ago breathing in her deck. He felt pride, tried to stand, and he pressed it down with both hands. The meeting ended with smiles that hid wagers and quiet weather reports. A voice said, "Growth climbs by burning old ladders." He left colder and taller, unsure which part was growth and which was ash. Morning broke with headlines that tasted like metal. Mira Sayeed stood beside a wall of contracts and spoke without tremor. Mira Sayeed said, "The core rail was pledged to the public, then privatized." Cameras leaned in as if sound had weight. Adrian Vale said, "Your claim distorts a chaotic year." A lawyer said, "We seek an injunction and control of the asset." The documents showed a transfer signed by Layla Vale. The signature glowed like a match in a dry room. A voice said, "Promises fail loudest when recorded." Mira Sayeed said, "We built this together, then you hid it behind shells." Adrian felt the floor adjust under him by a fatal inch. The city listened the way a jury breathes. The boardroom gathered like weather. A director said, "Is the rail actually encumbered?" Gareth Cole said, "It is clean." Adrian Vale said, "Explain the Layla transfer." Gareth Cole said, "Standard consolidation for speed." The words arrived with a smile that never reached his eyes. Counsel traced a date that did not love the calendar. A junior whispered that the timestamp predated a filing. Adrian heard thunder in a windowless room. Mira's deck looped in his mind like a fire drill. A voice said, "When truth knocks, walls learn music." Gareth Cole said, "We will bury this in process." Adrian Vale said, "Or it buries us." Silence signed its name on the oak. They met in the archive where paper keeps its own temperature. "I want Prestamamo." Mira Sayeed said, "This is the original charter." She slid a document that smelled like dust and beginnings. Adrian Vale said, "We were broke and hopeful." Mira Sayeed said, "We promised it open." She laid a scan beside it, and the signatures did not agree. Layla's name bent differently, like a note sung by another throat. Adrian Vale said, "No way." The words fell and did not bounce. Mira Sayeed said, "Your mentor forged a door and walked you through it." The past reshoot its invoice with penalties. A voice said, "Collapse begins as a correction." Adrian felt the boy in him reach for air. The injunction landed like a power cut. Council, said effective immediately, suspend transactions on the rail. Engineers watched dashboards bloom red. An ops lead said, we go dark in 5. Adrian Vale said, payout pending balances first. The room moved like a single muscle, trying not to cramp. Gareth Cole said, do nothing until I say. Adrian Vale said, do it now. The lights hummed as if considering loyalty. The system slowed, then yielded, then stopped. A voice said, the Empire pauses, and the silence is louder than loss. Someone exhaled like a confession and stared at their hands. In the garage, promises echoed like footsteps. Gareth Cole said, you do not survive this without me. Adrian Vale said, you forged my mother. Gareth Cole said, I protected the company you begged me to build. The truth wore his face like a mask that fit too well. Adrian remembered Layla's candle that never got lit. The crown felt cheap in his hands, and heavy anyway. Mira Sayeed said, stand up the truth or it will stand over you. Her message waited on his screen with no exclamation marks. A voice said, some debts pay with names, not numbers. Adrian Vale said, I will notify the authorities. The night did not answer, but the echo finally stopped running. The board gathered under lights bright enough to sterilize doubt. A director said, we will vote on disclosure and control. Gareth Cole said, this melodrama risks everything. Adrian Vale said, silence already cost more. The rain on glass ticked like a metronome for courage. Mira Sayeed watched as a guest, steady as a level. Council read clauses that tasted like chalk and endings. And Adrian Vale said, return the rail to the public trust and open our books. Gareth Cole said, you will destroy shareholder value. A junior director whispered, that value needs air to breathe. Ballots lifted like slow wings and cast shadows that felt like verdicts. A voice said, some empires are saved by the fire that burns them clean. The count began, and the room forgot to inhale. The town hall began with microphones that looked like confessions. Adrian Vale said, I authorized speed that invited wrong. The room rustled with disappointment and relief. He named the rail, the transfer, the forged curve in Layla's signature. Adrian Vale said, I am accountable, and I am stepping aside pending review. A veteran engineer nodded, as if a weather report had finally matched the sky. He turned to the camera that held a city. Adrian Vale said, to those shut out by our gates, the gate opens now. He looked for Mira, and found only the idea of her, exact and unsentimental. A voice said, apologies are keys if you keep turning them. He bowed, not to the room, but to the work bruised by his pace. The live stream chat crawled like rain across a window, and then it stilled. The corridor smelled of toner and rain when the investigators arrived. Gareth Cole said, you will regret choosing purity over survival. Adrian Vale said, I regret not choosing it sooner. The escorting officers moved with a patience that suggested inevitability. Gareth Cole said, I can name the shortcuts you blessed. Adrian Vale said, name them, and I will answer under oath. The elevator chimed, a quiet bell that closed seasons. Layla Vale's message buzzed, small and fierce, asking if truth finally had a chair. He typed that it did, and that he would sit in it. A voice said, the summit is a ridge, not a throne. The doors closed on a mentor who had mistaken guardianship for possession. The building's heartbeat slowed to something almost human. They met on the roof where wind edits sentences. Mira Sayeed said, you finally chose the cost. Adrian Vale said, I choose it with my signature, not speeches. He set papers on a metal table that remembered storms. The transfer placed the rail under a public trust with independent oversight. He added his resignation to the stack like a last page that rewrites the first. Mira Sayeed said, this does not fix us. Adrian Vale said, it fixes what we broke for others. Her eyes softened, and sharpened in the same breath. The city breathed through the parapet, unoffended by human scale. A voice said, "Some love survives as stewardship." She signed where the process asked, and nowhere else. The wind carried their silence like a flag with no logo. The shareholder hall filled with the sound of shoes that had come for endings. Adrian Vale said, "Today, I relinquish the office and return the rail we promised open." Applause rose, cautious and real. He thanked the teams who traded birthdays for uptime. He named Mira Sayeed as chair of the trust's advisory council, and the room recalibrated. Mira Sayeed said, "We will make the door we once sketched in the margins." He stepped off stage and found Adrian Vale waiting with a candle in a paper bag. Adrian Vale said, "No cake? Just you." They held each other while cameras looked elsewhere. A voice said, "Legacies are built where hands meet." He did not feel lighter, only truer. The crown slipped from habit, and the man finally stood without it. Morning arrived without cameras, and the city treated truth like weather that had finally broken. Turnstiles stood open where the rail met the street, and people flowed as if a dam forgot its job. A conductor said, "First day under the trust, welcome through." Adrian Vale said, "Good morning," and the word felt earned. He rode standing, a man unpracticed at ordinary balance. A student said, "It's free for transfers now," and smiled at nothing but relief. Adrian thought of signatures that once hid under his name, and let the car rock him honest. Adrian Vale called and asked, "Are you on time for life today?" Adrian Vale said, "I am, and I'm staying." The train dove into light, and his reflection looked less like a verdict, and more like a person. A voice said what was saved wasn't the crown, but the crossing. The trust convened, in a room that valued windows over walls. Mira Sayeed said, "Access first, margins second, audit always." An activist said, "Publish outages in real time." Mira Sayeed said, "Agreed, and publish fixes with names." An engineer said, "Safety requires slower rollouts." She nodded and let speed take a seat behind patience. A former rival offered praise shaped like bait, and she left it on the plate. Mira Sayeed said, "We are not here to punish profit. We are here to outlaw secrecy." The policy draft grew teeth that bit only when needed. A voice said, "Power, when tended, becomes a lantern." She signed the charter addendum and looked out at tracks that finally resembled a promise. The hearing room smelled like varnish and consequence. Counsel said, "State the accelerants you authorized." Adrian Vale said, "Deferred reviews, compressed sign-offs, and I knew the risk." An auditor said, "Did you benefit personally?" Adrian Vale said, "I benefited in reputation I did not deserve." The clerk typed a history that finally stopped arguing with itself. A regulator said, "Restitution proposals." Adrian Vale said, "Refunds for fees, equity for staff, and a fund to repair civic systems we strained." The panel listened the way bridges listen to wind. A junior founder waiting outside asked, "Is ambition still allowed?" Adrian Vale said, "Yes, just not at the cost of your name." A voice said, "Resolution is not erasing, it is engraving correctly." They met where the story started bleeding ink. The old discount store wore scaffolding like new bones. Mira Sayeed said, "We're turning this into a pantry and a tech classroom." Adrian Vale said, "I would like to help without owning it." She studied him as if scale could be measured by quiet. Mira Sayeed said, "Bring time, not leverage." Adrian Vale said, "I can bring both hands and leave the crown at home." The contractor waved blueprints that smelled like clean beginnings. They walked the aisles where hunger once taught math. A voice said, "Some repairs go backward before they go forward." She smiled and let the past sit, then stand, then walk beside them without pulling. Evening found the kitchen that once waited too long. Adrian Vale said, "No speeches, just the candle." Adrian Vale said, "I am here before the matches struck." He lit the wick, and did not wish for anything he could buy. They ate cake that tasted like time returned. The phone stayed face down, a small rebellion with frosting. Mira Vale said, "You learned to keep a door open." Adrian Vale said, "I learned who it's for." He placed a small trophy on a low shelf, where dust patrols humility. A voice said, "What remains is not glory, but capacity." The flame fluttered and held, as if practicing for storms with better endings. Dawn arrived like a gentle verdict, and the city exhaled. Trains slid through light, and turnstiles waited without teeth. Adrian Vale rode standing, awkward and relieved by the sway. A conductor said, "First week as a trust, welcome aboard." He nodded to strangers, and felt the word citizen fit. Mira Sayeed posted live metrics that refused varnish. Mira Sayeed said, "Hold us to this even when it stings." An elder smiled and said, "You finally cut the tolls." Mira Vale called and said, "Breakfast tonight, no speeches." Adrian Vale said, "I will arrive before the kettle sings." The train dove into a tunnel and surfaced with gentler eyes. A voice said, "What endured was the crossing, not the crown." Rain licked the windows and left only clean outlines. A student tapped a card and saw the fare read 0. Adrian touched the rail and felt it hum like a promise. The courthouse smelled like rain on marble and choices. A clerk said proceedings concluded, oversight affirmed. Gareth Cole said, "I protected value," and met a silence that kept the receipt. Adrian Vale said, "I authorized speed and accept its bill." Reporters circled with questions that had finally learned manners. A regulator said, "Publish your restitution milestones quarterly." Mira Sayeed said, "We will publish them monthly, signed by owners of fixes." The city outside moved without pausing for ceremony. Mira Vale texted a heart and nothing else. A junior founder whispered, "Ambition still matters, just not alone." A voice said, "Justice arrives on schedules, not drums." Adrian stepped into light that did not flinch, and kept walking. They met beside the river where glass towers practice humility. Mira Sayeed said, "The trust is stable, the pantry opens next week." Adrian Vale said, "I will teach on Saturdays, and say nothing about markets." Wind braided their sentences, and left them lighter. Mira Sayeed said, "You chased safety until it chased you." Adrian Vale said, "You were my first love and my greatest mirror." She smiled like someone accepting weather, not surrender. Seagulls wrote brief signatures no lawyer could forge. He offered an apology with no clause and no clock. She nodded and let it land where it could do work. A voice said, "Some threats are the scaffolds love avoids, until it is ready." They walked until the city felt like a room with the right door open. Night stitched fireworks to the edges of the skyline. In the kitchen, Mira Vale set 2 cups like anchors that choose kindness. Mira Vale said, "You can keep the door open and still rest." Adrian Vale said, "Rest feels like work I should have learned first." Steam curled upward and drew halos no crown could manage. He placed his old keycard in a drawer that needed nothing from him. Mira Vale said, "You are enough without the audience." He laughed in a way that made the cups sound warmer. Outside, sirens played at being trumpets, and then remembered their jobs. A voice said, "Peace is the invoice paid on time." They stood by the window and let the quiet announce itself without hurry. The boardroom sat empty, a museum of strategies that finally learned silence. A small tour paused at the door, and a guide said, "This is where they chose the open gate." The 8-year-old girl from the rain stepped forward and touched the chair. She was taller now by courage, not inches alone. Adrian Vale watched unseen and chose not to enter. Mira Sayeed stood down the hall and let the moment belong to her. The girl said, "One day, I want this room to be kinder than power." The guide nodded and wrote it on a plaque. Only she could see. Fireworks brushed the glass with soft thunder that meant ordinary joy. A voice said, "He left the company, but never left her."